The train groaned, a long sigh of steam and steel, and surrendered to the end of the line. Eleanor Whitfield stepped down from the carriage, and the Wyoming wind met her like a slap. It was not the damp, salty wind of Boston Harbor. This was a dry, scouring force that tasted of dust and immense, empty distance. It snatched at the chestnut-brown scarf wrapped around her neck, the soft wool a ghost of a touch from a life ago, her sister Cora's scarf. Eleanor's hand flew to it, clutching the fabric as if it were an anchor in this sea of parched land. The air smelled of things she had only read about in dime novels, the sharp tang of horse sweat, the bitter perfume of coal smoke from the engine, and an underlying scent of sun-baked earth and sage. Redemption Flats was less a town and more a hopeful suggestion, a single dusty street, a collection of raw timber buildings squinting in the harsh afternoon light, and the railroad station, which was little more than a shed. Beyond it, the high plains rolled away to meet a sky so vast and blue, it made her feel insignificant, a tiny, misplaced stitch in a boundless tapestry. This was a place that could swallow a person whole, or worse, a secret. The station platform was a chaotic dance of men in dusty hats and worn denims, their voices rough and loud. They moved with a purpose Eleanor did not feel, their world one of cattle and freight and hard labor. She stood by her single trunk, a figure in a modest gray traveling dress, feeling as foreign as a porcelain doll in a blacksmith's shop. A few men glanced her way, their gazes lingering with a frank curiosity that made her skin prickle. A mail-order bride was a spectacle, a gamble made visible. Then a man detached himself from the shadows of the station overhang and walked toward her. He was tall, but not in a way that commanded attention. Rather, he seemed to occupy his space with a quiet solidity, like a weathered fence post that had stood against 100 storms. His hat was pushed back, revealing a face tanned by the sun, with lines around the eyes that spoke of squinting into that same relentless sky. A faint, pale scar ran along his jawline, disappearing under his ear. It was a face that was neither handsome nor plain, but it was real. Miss Whitfield. His voice was low and even, a pleasant rumble that held no artifice. Eleanor nodded, her throat suddenly tight. Mr. Cole. Jackson is fine. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Welcome to Wyoming. His eyes met hers for a moment, clear and direct, and in them, she saw not the hungry curiosity of the other men, but a calm, assessing gravity. He was measuring her, just as she was measuring him. He reached for her trunk. Allow me, as he hefted the heavy wooden box. His hand brushed against hers. It was a fleeting, clumsy contact, his skin calloused and warm against her gloved fingers. A jolt, small but distinct, passed between them. It was the first human touch she had felt since leaving Boston, a simple, unadorned thing that somehow made her precarious situation feel terrifyingly solid. This was not a letter. This was a man. This was her life now. The journey to Cole Ridge was made in a sturdy buckboard wagon pulled by 2 stout mules. Jackson handled the reins with an easy competence, his hands gentle but firm. For a long while, they rode in a silence that was not uncomfortable. The creak of the wagon wheels and the soft plod of the mules' hooves were the only sounds, a rhythm that seemed to belong to the land itself. Not much like the city, he said finally, gesturing with his chin toward the endless expanse of sagebrush and rock. No, Eleanor agreed, her voice small against the wind. It is large. A faint smile touched his lips. It has a way of making a man feel his own size. That is Cole Ridge up ahead. He pointed toward a series of low hills, where a cluster of buildings huddled under the protective curve of a bluff. From this distance, it looked like a small fortress against the wilderness. The ranch is one of the few places in this valley with a reliable well. A deep stone well my father dug. It is the reason we can be here at all. Water is life out here. Miss Whitfield, more than gold, more than cattle. He spoke of the well with a kind of reverence, and Eleanor understood. In this dry, thirsty land, a source of clean, constant water was not just a resource. It was a miracle. It was the heart of his home, the foundation of the community he was trying to build. They were skirting the edge of a wide, shallow valley when the world exploded into chaos. The crack of a rifle shot split the air, sharp and violent, followed by a chorus of whoops and hollers. Riders appeared as if from the earth itself, pouring over a nearby ridge, their face obscured by green bandanas. The Lobo Verde gang. Their reputation had traveled even to the hushed parlors of Boston. Jackson swore, a low guttural sound, and snapped the reins. "Hold on." The mules lunged forward, the buckboard lurching violently. Dust plumed around them, thick and choking. Another bullet whined past Eleanor's ear, close enough for her to feel its heat. The men were not aiming to kill. Not yet. They were playing, a cruel game of cat and mouse, trying to drive the wagon off the trail and into the rocks. Panic seized Eleanor for a heartbeat, cold and sharp. This was it, the end of her desperate gamble. A foolish Eastern woman lost in a brutal, lawless land. Then, something else rose up through the fear, something cold and steady. It was the memory of her grandfather, a Marine with eyes as gray as the Atlantic, his voice calm as he placed a heavy pistol in her hand. Courage is not the absence of fear, Ellie. It is acting in spite of it. While Jackson fought the reins, his attention fixed on the treacherous path ahead. Eleanor moved. Her hands, steady now, went to the long, narrow case tucked beneath her seat. Her fingers found the latch. It was her grandfather's rifle, a Winchester he had given her for protection. She had thought it a dramatic, unnecessary gesture. She had been wrong. She slid the rifle free, the oiled steel cool and solid in her grasp. Bracing herself against the buckboard's violent sway, she worked the lever, chambering around. The action was smooth, familiar. She did not aim at any of the riders. Her grandfather had taught her that a warning shot, properly placed, was more powerful than a lucky hit. She aimed for a tall rock spire to the left of the lead rider, took a breath to steady her hands against the jolting ride, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, its report a deafening crack that was all her own. The bullet screamed off the rock, sending a shower of stone chips flying. The lead rider's horse shied violently, nearly unseating him. The outlaws reined in, their joyful whoops replaced by stunned silence. A woman with a rifle who knew how to use it. In that moment of hesitation, Jackson glanced at her. His eyes widened in disbelief, seeing not a frightened mail-order bride, but a woman of pale, determined fury holding a smoking rifle. A flicker of something respect. Astonishment crossed his face before his attention snapped back to the trail. And then the land itself offered salvation. A low rumble grew into a thunderous roar. From a draw to their right, a river of horseflesh surged into the valley. A herd of wild mustangs, spooked by the gunfire, galloped directly across their path. They were a magnificent, terrifying sight. A wave of raw, untamed power, their manes and tails flying, their hooves drumming a frantic beat against the hardpan. The Lobo Verde riders scattered, fighting to control their spooked mounts as the wild herd swept between them and the buckboard. Jackson saw his chance. He yelled, "Lashing the mules!" and plunged the wagon directly into the churning, dusty wake of the stampede. For a few heart-stopping moments, they were surrounded by the chaos. The smell of wild horse and fear thick in the air. Then they were through, breaking free on the other side as the last of the mustangs galloped away into the distance. They did not stop until the ranch was in sight. As they slowed, a lone rider approached from the direction of the town. He was handsome in a polished, predatory way, dressed in a tailored coat that seemed out of place against the dusty landscape. He rode a fine black gelding and smiled a smile that did not reach his cold, calculating eyes. "Cole, I saw the dust. Looked like you had some trouble, the man called out, his voice smooth as oiled leather. Jackson's jaw tightened. Nothing we couldn't handle. Silas. Is this the lovely bride? Silas Rourke's gaze swept over Eleanor. Lingering for a moment too long. A pleasure, ma'am. Silas Rourke. I own a fair bit of land east of here. I must say, you bring some excitement with you. Eleanor simply nodded, clutching the rifle across her lap. She did not like the way he looked at her, or the way his eyes seemed to be measuring the land around them, cataloging every blade of grass, every rock, every drop of potential water. I'm hosting a small gathering at the Redemption Saloon this weekend, Silas continued, his smile unwavering. A welcome for you, my dear, and a chance for the community to meet you. You must come, both of you. It was not an invitation. It was a demand wrapped in pleasantries. We will see, Jackson said, his tone clipped. He urged the mules forward, leaving Silas Rourke sitting on his black horse, a lone, dark figure against the setting sun. The Coal Ridge ranch house was simple and strong, built of thick timber and river stone. It was a man's house, clean but spare, with little in the way of softness or comfort. A Mexican woman with intelligent, watchful eyes and a long, dark braid met them at the door. Jackson introduced her as Maria Delgado, his best ranch hand. Maria. He called her Ria. The woman's handshake was firm, her nod a gesture of acknowledgement, not welcome. Eleanor felt she was being weighed and found wanting. Later that evening, after a simple meal of beans and jerky that Eleanor could barely swallow, Jackson stood by the cold stone hearth. The lamplight cast long shadows, making the room feel both intimate and immense. Miss Whitfield, he began, his voice quiet. This is a hard land. Today proved that. It asks a lot of a person. I understand that. Mr. Cole. I am a plain man. I made this arrangement because this ranch needs a woman's hand, and I would like a family, to build something that lasts. But it has to be a partnership. It has to be honest. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. Honesty, the one thing she could not offer. The circuit judge comes through these parts once every 3 months, he continued, turning to face her fully. That is when we can make this official. But there is a custom out here, a practical one, a 90-day trial. We live here, under this roof. We learn if we can abide one another. We see if a life can be built. At the end of that time, if either one of us finds this arrangement unsuitable, you will be given passage back to Boston, with enough money to start again. No harm, no foul. It is your choice. He was offering her a way out, a chance to confess her deception and flee. But where would she go? Back to the shame and debt in Boston, back to the quiet graveyard where her sister, the real Cora Whitfield, lay buried. She had made a promise on that grave, a promise to save their family's name, to take this chance and build a life worthy of the one her sister had lost. Her own name, Eleanor, felt like a stone in her mouth. She was living a lie, a betrayal that grew heavier with every breath of this dry Wyoming air. But the thought of returning to that old life was a different kind of death. Looking at Jackson Cole, at his steady eyes and the quiet strength in his hands, she saw a flicker of hope, a chance for something real, even if it was built on a foundation of deceit. I agree to your terms, Mr. Cole, she said, her voice a near whisper. He nodded. The matter settled. Good. You can take the room at the top of the stairs. I will see you at sunrise. He left her then, alone in the main room. Outside, the wind howled a lonely song across the plains. Eleanor walked to the window and looked out into the profound, star-littered darkness. 90 days. She had 90 days to become the woman Jackson Cole believed her to be, all while praying he would never discover the woman she truly was. The weight of the lie settled around her shoulders, as heavy and as real as the chestnut scarf she still wore. Life at Coal Ridge began before the sun. The first lesson Eleanor learned was that the high plains did not wait for a person to be ready. in the pre-dawn chill, with the sky a bruised purple. She followed Rhea to the milking shed. The air was thick with the warm, sweet smell of hay and cows. Her first attempt at milking was a clumsy failure, resulting in a thin, useless stream and a swat from the cow's impatient tail. Rhea watched, arms crossed, a small, humorless smile on her lips. "The beast knows your hands have never done a day's work," she said, her voice matter-of-fact. "Then they will have to learn," Eleanor replied, her jaw set. She repositioned the stool and tried again, mimicking Rhea's firm, rhythmic motion. Slowly, a proper stream of milk began to hiss into the pail. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. The days fell into a rhythm dictated by the needs of the ranch. There were calves to be herded into a separate pen, their bewildered calls a constant, plaintive chorus. There were hooves to be checked and treated with a foul-smelling tar. There were endless lists of supplies to be inventoried. Eleanor's hands, once accustomed to needlepoint and the cool ivory of piano keys, became chapped, then calloused. Her muscles ached with a profound weariness she had never imagined. Yet, with the ache came a strange sense of satisfaction. She was earning her place, one blister at a time. She learned to ride, a terrifying prospect at first. Jackson assigned her a calm, intelligent mare named Juniper. He showed her how to saddle the horse, his large, capable hands moving with an economy of motion. "Talk to her," he advised. "Let her know you mean no harm. Horses are honest creatures. They sense a lie." The words sent a chill down Eleanor's spine. Her conversations with Rhea were brief and practical, clipped exchanges over mending tack or sorting beans. Yet, a grudging respect began to form between them. Rhea, who had seen a dozen soft Easterners defeated by this land, saw a flicker of steel in the mail-order bride. "You do not complain," Rhea observed one afternoon as they repaired a section of fence. "Who would I complain to?" Eleanor asked, pulling the wire taut. "The wind." Rhea gave a short, sharp laugh. "The wind does not listen. It only takes—" Just as Eleanor began to feel she might find a foothold in this new world, the world pushed back. A delegation from the Redemption Ladies' Purity Society arrived one afternoon. Unannounced, they were 3 women, led by a stern, hawk-nosed woman named Martha Gable, the preacher's wife. They sat stiffly in the main room, their gloved hands clutching their Bibles like weapons. "Miss Whitfield, Mrs. Gable began, her voice devoid of warmth. "It has come to our attention that you have arrived in our community under unusual circumstances. I am to be Mr. Cole's wife," Eleanor said, keeping her voice even. "A mail-order arrangement, Mrs." Gable sniffed, as if the term itself were a contagion. "While the scripture does not explicitly forbid it, the moral character of our town is paramount. We would feel more assured, as would the Lord, if we could see the letters of correspondence between you and Mr. Cole, and perhaps a letter of reference from your clergyman in Boston, attesting to your virtue." The demand hung in the air, a public inquisition disguised as pious concern. Eleanor's letters, the ones written in her sister Cora's name, were a tapestry of careful omissions and outright lies. To show them would be to expose herself completely. "My correspondence is a private matter between myself and my future husband," Eleanor said, her voice colder than she intended. "And my virtue is a matter between myself and God. I do not believe it requires a committee's approval." The women bristled. Martha Gable rose to her feet, her face a mask of indignation. "Pride is a sin. Miss Whitfield, we are a God-fearing community. We will be watching." After they left, a heavy silence filled the house. The whispers of the town had been given a voice, and they had found her wanting. A few days later, Jackson found her in the corral, staring blankly at the distant mountains. He carried a coiled lariat. He did not mention the visit from the Ladies' Society, but his presence was a quiet statement of support. "Every hand on this ranch needs to know how to throw a rope," he said simply. He built a small loop and showed her how to swing it in a flat, even circle over her head. It is all in the wrist. You do not force it, you guide it. He stood behind her, his chest close to her back, and took her hand to guide the motion. His touch was impersonal, the way a teacher's would be, but his nearness was overwhelming. She could feel the warmth of him, smell the faint scent of leather and dust that clung to his clothes. "Now," he murmured, his voice low by her ear. "When you release, keep your eye on the post." Her heart was beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She threw. The rope sailed out, clumsy and misshapen, and fell to the ground in a useless heap far from the fence post. A small smile touched his lips. Again. They spent the better part of an hour like that. He was patient, his instructions clear and calm, and slowly, she began to get the feel of it. The delicate balance of momentum and release. Finally, she threw the rope, and the loop sailed through the air, perfect and round, and settled cleanly over the post. A gasp of pure delight escaped her. She turned to him, her face flushed with triumph, and found him watching her, his expression unreadable. The air between them shifted, charged with something unspoken. The teacher and pupil were gone, and in their place were a man and a woman, alone under the vast Wyoming sky. He seemed to lean in slightly, and for a breathless moment, Eleanor thought he might kiss her. Then he took a small step back, breaking the spell. "Good," he said, his voice a little rough. "You are a quick study." The next day, as he was preparing to ride out and check on the herd, he paused by his saddle. He ran a hand over the worn leather. "Do you see this?" he asked. Carved skillfully into the swell of the saddle was a small, six-pointed star. It was an old mark, the edges softened with time and use. "My father carved it there," Jackson said, his gaze distant. "During the war, he told me it was a reminder that a man makes promises to his family, to his land, to himself. He said this star was to remember to keep your people safe, no matter the cost. It is a promise to come home." He looked at her then, and Eleanor felt the weight of his words. He was showing her a piece of his soul, the code he lived by. It was a code built on loyalty and protection, and she was standing before him, the beneficiary of that promise, while living a profound lie. The guilt was a physical thing, a knot tightening in her stomach. The conflict with Silas Rourke escalated a week later. 2 men from the county surveyor's office rode out to Coal Ridge. Silas was with them. They unrolled a map on the long table in the main room. "Jackson," the county man said, "the railroad is paying for a new fence line to keep cattle from straying onto the tracks. The proposed route runs along this ridge here." His finger traced a line on the map that cut directly across a corner of Coal Ridge property, the very corner where the stone well was located. "That is my land," Jackson said, his voice dangerously quiet, "and that is my well." "It is for the public good," Silas interjected smoothly. "Progress. And the county is prepared to offer you a very generous compensation for the small parcel of land. I have seen to it myself. My water is not for sale." "Silas," Jackson said, his eyes locking with Rourke's, "not for any price. Be reasonable." "Cole," Silas said, his smile thin, "it is just a fence. You will still have access. It will simply be managed by the county, for the good of the whole valley." Eleanor watched the 2 men, seeing the deep, unmovable opposition between them. Jackson was a man of the land, his roots sunk deep as the well itself. Silas was a man of paper and ink, of legal loopholes and veiled threats. He did not want to manage the water. He wanted to control it. The meeting ended in a stalemate, with the county men promising to review the surveys and Silas leaving with a look of smug certainty. The threat was no longer a whisper. It was a line drawn on a map, inching closer to the heart of the ranch. 2 weeks before her 90-day trial was set to end, the stagecoach from Cheyenne delivered a small, sturdy parcel wrapped in brown paper. It was addressed to Miss Cora Whitfield. Eleanor's hands trembled as she took it. She knew what it was before she opened it. Inside, nestled among Cora's few remaining keepsakes, was a crisp, official document from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. It was her sister's death certificate. The stark black letters spelled out the date and the cause of the fever that had taken her. It was the final, irrefutable proof of her lie. She stared at the paper, the words blurring through her tears. She could not do this anymore. She could not look Jackson in the eye, or accept the quiet respect he was beginning to show her, or stand by his side against men like Silas, all while carrying this deception. It was a poison, and it was tainting everything. She would tell him, tonight. She would confess everything, show him the certificate, and accept the consequences. He would send her away. Of course, the shame would be immense, but it would be better than this slow corrosion of her soul. That evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, she found Jackson by the well, staring down into its stony depths. The death certificate was a folded square in her pocket, its edges sharp against her thigh. "Mr. Cole," she began, her voice shaking. "Jackson, I have something I must tell you." He did not look up immediately. He was lowering a bucket on the rope, his movement slow, deliberate. He hauled it up, the rope groaning in protest. He looked into the bucket, then peered back down into the darkness of the well. "The water level," he said, his voice flat with a new, raw worry she had never heard before. "It is down. It is down by at least a foot." He finally looked at her, and the personal confession she had been about to make died on her lips. She saw in his face the dawning of a fear far greater than a personal betrayal. It was an ancient, primal fear, the fear of a land turning to dust. The drought, long whispered about in the town, was no longer a threat on the horizon. It had arrived. It was here, at the bottom of their well. Eleanor's confession turned to ash in her mouth. The personal crisis of her identity was a flickering candle against the inferno of the coming drought. Jackson's words about the falling water level hung in the air, heavier than any lie she carried. In the days that followed, the sun became a malevolent eye in a bleached white sky. The vibrant greens of the high plains faded to a brittle, dusty yellow. The earth cracked into a mosaic of thirst, and the wind carried not the scent of sage and pine, but the smell of desolation. The cattle grew listless, their heads hanging low, their ribs beginning to show. The sound of their lowing became a constant, mournful prayer for rain that never came. Jackson's face grew hard, the lines around his eyes deepening. He and Rhea and the other hands rode out for longer stretches, searching for any patch of surviving grass, their movements economical, their words few. The ranch was holding its breath, waiting for a blow to fall. Eleanor watched, her feeling of helplessness a constant, bitter taste. She was an outsider, a woman of the city where water came from a tap, not a prayer. But she had managed a household, kept accounts, and organized church charity drives. She understood systems. One evening, she sat at the long timber table with a ledger and a piece of charcoal, the death certificate a cold, forgotten weight in her trunk. She sketched a map of the valley, marking Coal Ridge and the smaller homesteads that dotted the landscape. She listed families, estimated herd sizes, and calculated needs. She approached Jackson the next morning as he repaired a bridle, his hands moving with frustrated energy. "We cannot create more water," she began, her voice steady. "But we can control how it is used. We need a schedule." He stopped his work and looked at her, his expression wary. She laid the ledger on a barrelhead, a rationing plan. The Coal Ridge well must serve the entire valley if we are to survive. We allocate water based on need. So many barrels per family, per day, so much for essential livestock. We set times for collection. It must be fair, and it must be absolute. Otherwise, fear will make everyone enemies. He studied her neat columns and the carefully drawn map. He saw not a frightened Easterner, but a commander planning a campaign. A slow nod was his only reply, Putting the plan into action was another matter. Jackson called a meeting at the small Redemption church house. The air inside was stifling, thick with the smell of dry dust and anxious men. Farmers and ranchers with worried faces and sun-cracked hands listened as Jackson laid out Eleanor's plan. The reaction was immediate and hostile. A burly farmer named Jebediah Stone, his face red with anger, slammed his hand on a pew. "I will not be told by some mail-order woman from Boston how to water my own stock," he bellowed. "What does she know of this life? She has been here 2 months. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the small crowd. They looked at Eleanor, their eyes filled with suspicion and resentment. She was an outsider, presuming to dictate the terms of their survival. Before Jackson could reply, a calm voice cut through the anger. It was Reverend Ames, a man whose quiet faith was matched by a sturdy pragmatism. "Brother Stone," he said, rising from his seat, "the plan is not this woman's. It is Mr. Cole's proposal, and it is based on a principle as old as the scriptures, that of the shepherd who cares for his entire flock, not just the strongest sheep. We are a community, or we are nothing." The debate raged, but the Reverend's words had shifted the ground. Fear was still present, but a seed of reason had been planted into this tense atmosphere. Silas Rourke made his entrance. He did not come in anger, but with a smile of benevolent concern. 2 well-dressed men from Cheyenne flanking him. Gentlemen, Silas said, his voice a soothing balm on their raw nerves. "There is no need for such division. I believe I have a solution that will benefit us all." He unrolled a diagram showcasing a piece of modern machinery, a steam-powered drilling rig. "This is the future. We need not rely on one old stone well. I am prepared, at my own expense, to bring in this equipment and drill a new, deeper well right here in the valley. A well that will provide water for everyone, in abundance." A hopeful silence fell over the room. The offer seemed like a miracle. "What do you want in return?" Silas Jackson's voice was flat, cutting through the optimism. Silas's smile widened. "A small thing. A simple right-of-way. Legal access to a trail across a northern section of your property. Jackson, to move my own equipment and supplies to my holdings in the east. It is a minor legal formality, a gesture of neighborly cooperation." Eleanor saw the trap instantly. A legal right-of-way was a permanent claim, a foot in the door that could never be closed. It would give Silas a legitimate reason to have men and equipment on Coal Ridge property at any time. It was a surrender of sovereignty disguised as a gift. Jackson saw it too. "My land is not a public road, Silas, and my answer is no." The room erupted again, this time with men shouting at Jackson, calling him selfish and proud. He was turning down salvation for the sake of a patch of dirt. The meeting broke up with nothing resolved, the community more fractured than ever, with Jackson and Eleanor standing on one side and Silas Rourke, the generous benefactor, on the other. That night, Eleanor sat in her room, the lamplight casting a warm glow on a fresh sheet of paper. Her hands trembled as she dipped the pen in ink. "Dearest Jackson," she wrote. The words felt like a betrayal. She wrote of Cora, of the fever, of the crushing debt and the fear of disgrace that had driven her to this desperate act. She confessed that her name was not Cora, but Eleanor. She explained that every day. His kindness and integrity made the weight of her deception more unbearable. She filled the page, the ink blotting here and there with a fallen tear. When she was done, she folded the letter, but she could not bring herself to seal it. To give it to him would be to end this fragile new life. It would mean packing her trunk and facing the lonely journey back east. She looked out the window at the dark, sprawling land and the brilliant, indifferent stars. For the first time, the thought of leaving felt not like a relief, but like a desolation. She slid the unsealed letter into a small wooden box with her sister's few keepsakes and hid it away. The attack came 2 nights later, without warning. A fierce orange glow woke the ranch, painting the undersides of the clouds in hellish color. The dry goods storehouse, filled with flour, beans, salted meat, and other vital winter supplies, was a roaring inferno. Men shouted, running with useless buckets of precious water. The heat was immense, the sound a hungry, devouring roar. There was nothing to be done but watch it burn, to watch their security for the coming winter turn to smoke and ash. By dawn, all that remained was a smoking, blackened ruin. As Jackson poked through the charred timbers, his face grim, Rhea knelt in the dust nearby. "Jackson," she called, her voice tight. "Look." In a patch of soft earth sheltered from the worst of the fire, there were clear boot prints. They were not from the worn, familiar boots of the ranch hands. These were newer, with a distinctive star pattern on the heel, a pattern known to belong to the men who rode with the Lobo Verde gang. Jackson stared at the prints, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. There was no direct proof, nothing a sheriff would act on, but he knew. He knew as sure as he knew the sun would rise that Silas Rourke's hands were behind this. It was a message: defy me, and I will burn you to the ground. The news of the fire and the dwindling supplies spread a fresh wave of despair through the valley. The ranchers and their families were not just thirsty now, they were hungry. They faced a winter of starvation. It was in this moment of utter hopelessness that Eleanor found her voice, not in a confession, but in a command. She strode into the main house where Jackson was meeting with a few of his closest hands, their face a study in defeat. "The men are exhausted and hungry," she announced, her tone leaving no room for argument. "They cannot work if they do not eat. We have lost our stores, but the women in this valley have not lost their kitchens. We will bake." The men looked at her as if she had lost her mind. "Mrs. Gable's society may be concerned with my virtue," Eleanor continued, her eyes flashing, "but they are also women of the church. They know charity, and they have flour in their pantries. So do the other homesteads. We will organize them. We will set up a field kitchen. We will bake bread, day and night. We will make stew from what game we can hunt. We will keep these men on their feet, and we will save that herd." A flicker of something not hope, but a fighting spark returned to Jackson's eyes. He saw the same woman who had coolly fired a rifle under attack. She was not offering comfort, she was offering a battle plan. What followed was a quiet miracle of logistics and will. Eleanor rode Juniper, not as a student, but as a courier, a general, a diplomat. She met with Martha Gable, not with defiance, but with a plea for their shared survival, appealing to her Christian duty. She organized the other ranch wives, women who had once looked at her with suspicion. She created schedules for baking, for collecting firewood, for portioning out the meager meals. The women responded, united by a common threat. They put aside their judgments and fired up their ovens. The smell of baking bread began to drift over the valley, a scent of defiance against the smell of smoke and dust. The women worked together, their hands kneading dough, their voices sharing worries and strengthening resolve. Eleanor was at the center of it, her ledger now filled not with water rations, but with flour counts and baking shifts. She had found her place, not as a mail-order bride, but as a leader. The community, born of desperation, was beginning to believe in her. They were beginning to see that her strength was not in a rifle, but in her unyielding will to build, even among the ashes. The bread was a small miracle, but it could not make rain. The grass in the lower valley was gone, chewed down to the roots and baked to the color of bone. Jackson made the decision on a morning when the air was so still and hot it felt like a weight on the lungs. "We are taking them up," he announced to the assembled hands, his voice leaving no room for debate. "To the high meadows. There is still grazing there, enough to last a few weeks if we are lucky." It was a desperate gamble. The high country was rugged, the trail treacherous, and it would leave the ranch itself vulnerable. But to stay was to watch the herd starve to death. The men nodded, their faces grim. They knew there was no other choice. Eleanor expected to be told to stay behind, to manage the kitchens and keep the fragile peace in the valley. Instead, Jackson sought her out as she packed provisions. "I need you to ride with us." "Eleanor," he said, using her real name in a low voice, a quiet acknowledgement of the letter she had written but never delivered. He did not ask how or why. He simply accepted the truth he had likely always suspected. "Rhea will lead the point. I will take the drag. I need your eyes in the middle. You see things. You see what is coming." A young, wiry hand named Maggie O'Rourke, barely 19, was assigned to ride with her. Maggie had a quick smile and a boundless, nervous energy. She idolized Rhea and looked at Jackson with a reverence usually reserved for saints. She was a good rider, but her youth sometimes made her reckless. The cattle drive began as a slow, trudging river of horns and hides. The dust rose in a permanent cloud around them, coating their clothes, their faces, their lungs. It was monotonous, grueling work, a constant battle to keep the herd moving, to turn back strays, and to push them onwards and upward. They had been on the trail for 2 days when the sky began to change. The endless, pale blue was tainted by a sickly yellow haze in the west. The wind, which had been a hot, steady breath, grew fickle, gusting and then falling silent. An unnatural stillness descended, and the cattle grew restless, their lowing taking on a new, anxious pitch. Rhea rode back to them, her face etched with concern. "Dust storm!" she shouted over the rising wind. "A bad one! We need to find cover." There is a series of rock formations a mile ahead, in the canyon. The push became a frantic race against the approaching wall of darkness. The yellow haze had become a churning, brown beast that seemed to be devouring the sky. The wind shrieked, carrying sand that stung their exposed skin like 1,000 tiny needles. It became hard to see, hard to breathe. The world was reduced to a maelstrom of grit and noise. The cattle, terrified, began to break. A flash of lightning, eerie and green in the brown gloom, split the sky. A large steer, maddened with fear, bolted from the herd, crashing directly toward Maggie. The young woman's horse reared, screaming, and Maggie, caught off guard, lost her seat. She tumbled to the ground in the path of the stampeding animal. Time seemed to slow. Eleanor saw the steer's wild eyes, the massive head lowered to charge, the thundering hooves about to crush the fallen rider. Without thinking, she spurred Juniper forward, angling the mare to intercept the beast. She did not have a rifle, only the heavy stock whip coiled at her saddle. She yanked it free and, with a flick of her wrist, learned from hours of watching the ranch hands, she cracked it in the air. The sound was like a pistol shot, sharp and sudden. It exploded right beside the steer's head. The animal faltered, confused by the unexpected threat, and veered away, crashing back into the herd. In that same instant, Rhea was there, her horse a blur of motion, grabbing Maggie's arm and hauling her to her feet and out of the churning chaos. The herd, now a panicked mob, surged past them. Eleanor felt a searing pain in her hand as a stray rope, dragging from a runaway calf, whipped across her knuckles, tearing the skin. She barely noticed. She, Rhea, and a few other riders worked frantically, their shouts swallowed by the wind, turning the stampede, pushing the terrified animals toward the relative safety of the canyon walls. They found shelter in a wide, shallow cave, a deep overhang in the rock that provided refuge from the worst of the storm. The wind howled outside, a physical presence that seemed intent on scouring the world clean. They huddled in the semi-darkness, the cattle packed tightly at the mouth of the cave, their warmth and trembling a comfort against the elemental fury. Hours passed. The storm did not abate. As darkness fell, the temperature plummeted, the wind now carrying an icy edge. They lit a single lantern, its flickering glow a small, brave circle against the immense, roaring night. Jackson made his way to Eleanor, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion. He saw her cradling her injured hand. "Let me see," he said, his voice quiet but firm. She held it out. The rope burn was angry and red. the skin scraped raw and beaded with blood. He gently took her hand in his. His touch was surprisingly delicate for a man whose life was hard labor. He cleaned the wound with a cloth dampened with precious water from his canteen, his movements careful and sure. He then wrapped it tightly with a strip of clean linen from his saddlebag. All the while, neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say that the storm was not already screaming. His focused, gentle care was more eloquent than any words of gratitude or concern. When he was finished, he did not immediately let go of her hand. They sat in the flickering light, the roar of the wind a constant companion, a strange and profound intimacy settling between them. They were stripped of everything but the present moment, two people seeking shelter from a world turned hostile. The cold deepened, a biting, relentless thing that seeped into their bones. Shivers racked Eleanor's body. She saw Maggie huddled with Rhea, the two women sharing a single blanket, trying to conserve warmth. Jackson watched her for a moment, then shifted closer. "We will freeze like this," he said, his voice a low rumble. He did not ask permission. He simply opened his heavy duster coat and wrapped an arm around her, pulling her against his side. His body was a solid wall of warmth against the cold. Eleanor leaned into him, her head finding the hollow of his shoulder. She could feel the steady, slow beat of his heart through the thick fabric of his shirt. It was the calmest, most reassuring sound she had ever heard. This was not a gesture of romance, but of survival. Yet, as they sat there, huddled together against the cold and the dark, something deeper passed between them. It was a silent acknowledgement of all they had endured together, a shared vulnerability that was more intimate than a kiss. She felt a surprising, overwhelming sense of safety, of being, for the first time in a long time, exactly where she was supposed to be, protected, home. She closed her eyes, the fury of the storm outside fading to a distant murmur, and drifted into an exhausted sleep. The world was born anew in the morning. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky washed clean and a landscape scoured and reshaped. The air was crisp and cool, every rock and distant mesa etched in sharp relief. As they emerged from the cave, blinking in the bright, new light, Jackson stopped, his gaze fixed on the canyon wall opposite them. The storm had done more than blow sand. It had acted like a giant chisel, stripping away loose rock and soil. Halfway up the cliff face, a dark, wet stain glistened in the morning sun. From it, a tiny, determined trickle of water seeped down the rock, nurturing a patch of impossibly green moss. "A seep," Jackson breathed, his voice filled with a reverence Eleanor had heard only once before, when he had first spoken of his father's well. The water table must be high here, close to the surface. It was a sign, a promise from the land that had so brutally attacked them. It was a glimmer of hope so bright it was almost blinding. They had found water, a place where a new well, a secondary well, might be dug, a way to fight back. The drive back to the ranch was imbued with a cautious optimism. The herd was smaller, but it was alive, and now they had a future, a tangible plan to survive the drought. They topped the final rise overlooking the Coal Ridge homestead in the late afternoon. The ranch lay quiet and peaceful in the valley below. But as they drew closer, Jackson reined in his horse, his body going tense. He was staring at a patch of ground near the northern boundary line, not far from the stone well. Eleanor followed his gaze. She saw nothing at first, just the familiar sweep of dry grass and rock. Then she saw it. The earth was disturbed. A series of deep, cylindrical holes had been bored into the ground, a pattern of unnatural, mechanical intrusion. Alongside them were the faint tracks of a heavy wagon and the distinctive prints of shod horses, different from their own. Rhea rode up beside them. Her eyes narrowed. "Drill marks," she said, her voice laced with cold fury. "Someone has been taking test samples." There was only one person with the equipment and the audacity to trespass on Coal Ridge land for such a purpose. While they had been fighting for their lives against the storm, Silas Rourke had been advancing his own campaign, quietly and illegally probing for the source of their water, treating their home as nothing more than a problem on a map to be solved. The hope they had carried back from the mountains curdled into a cold, hard anger. The battle lines, once blurred by community debates and veiled threats, were now carved into the earth itself. This was no longer a war of words. It was a war for the land, for the water, for survival, and it had just begun. The discovery of Silas Rourke's trespassing drill marks cast a long, cold shadow over the fragile hope the water seep had given them. It was a violation, a quiet declaration of war that soured the air. For days, an unspoken tension gripped the ranch. Jackson was coiled tight with a fury he kept leashed. His words clipped, his eyes constantly scanning the northern boundary as if expecting an army to appear. Eleanor felt the weight of her own secret pressing down, a dishonesty that felt like a betrayal in the face of this new, shared threat. The 90-day trial was nearly over, and she was living under a false name, a false pretense. While this man prepared to defend the very ground beneath her feet, she could not stand by his side as a lie. She found him late one afternoon on the rocky ridge that overlooked the valley. The sun was sinking, bathing the parched land in a soft, melancholic light of deep orange and purple. A cold wind swept up from the plains, whipping strands of hair across her face and forcing her to pull her shawl tighter. Below, the ranch's herd of horses, a dark, fluid river of life, was making its slow way back to the corral for the night. The scene was beautiful and lonesome, a perfect backdrop for a painful truth. Jackson did not seem surprised to see her. He stood watching the horses, his profile a stark silhouette against the dying light. "They always come home," he said, his voice quiet, almost speaking to himself, "no matter how far they roam during the day." Eleanor stood beside him, her hands clenched at her sides. Her heart hammered a frantic, suffocating rhythm. "Jackson," she began, her voice barely a whisper, "I cannot let another day pass. The letter I wrote, the one I never gave you, it was a confession." He turned to look at her then, his gaze steady and patient. He did not rush her. He simply waited for the truth he had likely known was coming. "The woman you sent for, the woman who wrote those letters, was my sister," she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "My twin sister, Cora." She took a deep breath, the cold air stinging her lungs. "Cora passed away from a fever 2 weeks before I was set to travel. Our family, we were in debt, a terrible debt. Her passing would have meant disgrace, the loss of our home. So I took her place. I signed her name on the marriage contract. I traveled here under her name." She finally looked him in the eye, prepared for the anger, the disgust, the cold dismissal she deserved. "My name is Eleanor Whitfield. I came here under false pretenses. I have lied to you every single day I have been under your roof." The silence that followed was immense, broken only by the mournful cry of the wind. Jackson's expression did not change. He looked from her face to the distant horizon and back again, his thoughts hidden behind those calm, serious eyes. Overwhelmed by his silence, her own guilt and shame crested in a wave of self-loathing. All the strength she had found in the dust storm, all the purpose she had discovered in the community kitchen, it all crumbled, leaving her feeling like the fraud she was. Her shoulders slumped. "I'm just the male bride," she sighed, the words heavy with defeat, a counterfeit one at that. He took a step closer, his movement sudden and decisive. He reached out and gently took her chin, tilting her face up so she had no choice but to meet his gaze. The setting sun lit the silver in his eyes. "No," he said, his voice low and certain, a gravelly sound that seemed to come from the very bedrock of the land. "My wife for life." The words stunned her. They were not words of forgiveness, for they implied there was nothing to forgive. They were words of acceptance, of choice. He was not choosing the woman in the letters, the idealized Cora. He was choosing her, Eleanor, the woman who had stood up to outlaws, who had faced down the ladies' society, who had organized a kitchen from nothing and saved a young woman from being trampled. He was choosing the person she truly was. Tears she had not realized she was holding back welled in her eyes and traced hot paths through the dust on her cheeks. "But the contract," she stammered, "it has Cora's name." "It is a piece of paper," he said, dismissing it with a small shake of his head. "I have lived alongside you for 2 months. I have seen your strength. I have seen your courage. I have seen your heart. It is Eleanor I want for my wife, not a name on a piece of paper." He let go of her chin and reached into his vest pocket. He pulled out a simple leather thong, a thin strip of rawhide. Tied to its center was a small, flat circle of wood, no bigger than a silver dollar. Burned carefully into its surface was the same 6-pointed star she had seen on his saddle, the symbol of his promise. "My father gave me this when I first left home. He said a smaller version of the one on his saddle, so I would never forget my way, or what I was fighting for." He held it out to her. "I want you to have it." Her hands trembled as she accepted it. The wood was smooth and warm from his body. "A promise," he continued, "is not about a name. It is about a person. I promise to keep you safe. Eleanor, to stand with you. For life." He took the leather thong from her and gently tied it around her wrist. It was not a ring, not a jewel, but it felt more binding than any metal, more precious than any stone. It was a tangible piece of his history, his honor, and he was giving it to her. Their new, fragile peace was shattered 2 days later, believing that their union must be built on truth, not just between themselves, but within the community. They went to see Reverend Ames to formally request he marry them. They told him the whole story, holding nothing back. The Reverend, a man of quiet wisdom, listened patiently and agreed, seeing the truth of their commitment in their eyes. But news in a town like Redemption had a life of its own. It did not walk, it ran. Within a day, Martha Gable and her Purity Society were at their door once more. This time, there was no pretense of a social call. It was an execution squad. "Mr. Cole, Mrs." Gable announced, her face a thundercloud of righteous fury. "We have been made aware of a most grievous deception. This woman is not who she claims to be. She is an imposter. She has come into our community, into your home, under a cloud of unforgivable falsehood. The marriage contract is fraudulent. This arrangement must be terminated at once, for the sake of public decency and the laws of God." Eleanor stood her ground, Jackson's presence a solid warmth beside her. The leather thong on her wrist was a secret source of strength. "There is no deception, Mrs. Gable," Jackson said, his voice calm and cold as riverstone. "I am aware of everything, and I have asked Eleanor to be my wife. The Reverend has agreed to marry us at the end of the week." Martha Gable's jaw dropped. "You would knowingly enter into a union founded on such a sinful lie. You would condone this behavior." "I would stand by the woman I have chosen," Jackson countered, his gaze unwavering. "The woman who saved a life during the storm and who fed this valley when its spirit was broken. Her character is not defined by a name she was forced to use, but by the actions I have seen with my own eyes. We will be married, and we will do so before this entire community. So there are no more questions." His public declaration was a shield, thrown up to protect her honor. He was not hiding her or their story. He was owning it, daring the town to judge him as well as her. He was turning their private promise on the ridge into a public vow. Mrs. Gable, sputtering with indignation but faced with a will as unmovable as the mountains, finally retreated, promising prayers for their fallen souls. That evening, as the last light faded from the sky and a chill wind whispered of the coming winter, they stood by the new site they had chosen for the secondary well, the place where the water seep had given them hope. The ground was marked, the plans laid. The work would begin tomorrow, a project not just for the ranch, but for the whole valley, a future built on a shared resource, a shared effort. A profound quiet settled between them. They had faced the truth, and they had faced the judgment of their neighbors. They were still standing, together. Jackson turned to her, his face softened by the twilight. He reached out and gently touched the leather thong on her wrist, his thumb tracing the burned star. "My wife for life," he murmured, repeating the words that had remade her world. And then, under the vast, cold, star-littered sky, he leaned down and kissed her. It was not a kiss of frantic passion, but of deep and abiding certainty. It was gentle and firm, a kiss that tasted of dust and wind and the promise of a home. It was the sealing of a vow, a quiet moment of grace in a harsh and unforgiving land. In that kiss, they decided, without words, to face whatever came next, from Silas Rourke's schemes to the town's scorn. As one, their first act as a truly united pair would be to dig, to bring forth new water for a thirsty land, and to build a new life from the ground up. The digging of the new well began with a spirit of unified defiance. It was backbreaking labor under a relentless sun, but every swing of a pickaxe, every bucket of earth hauled away, was a blow against Silas Rourke and the drought that held them hostage. Men who had argued in the church house now worked side by side, their shared sweat a more potent bond than any sermon. Eleanor, with her ledger and her quiet authority, coordinated the effort, ensuring the workers were fed and the precious water from the old well was rationed for the task. For a brief, hopeful period, it felt as though the community was healing itself, forging a new strength from the earth. But Silas Rourke did not fight with pickaxes. He fought with paper and whispers. One morning, a deputy from the county seat rode out and nailed a notice to the door of the Redemption Church. It was a legal document, filled with dense, impenetrable language, but its meaning was chillingly clear, citing an obscure and long-forgotten prospecting permit filed years before the valley was settled. Silas Rourke had formally petitioned the territorial court to grant him exclusive mineral and water rights to the entire watershed, including the land on which both the old stone well and their new digging site were located. It was a preposterous claim, a legal ghost resurrected to haunt them. But it was official. A hearing was set for the next time the circuit judge arrived. The work on the new well did not stop, but the hopeful spirit evaporated, replaced by a grim, anxious resolve. At the same time, the harassment began. It was never direct, never anything that could be proven. A section of fence would be cut in the night, allowing a dozen steers to wander off into the hills. A sack of grain would be slashed, its precious contents spilling into the dust. The Lobo Verde gang was never seen, but their presence was felt, a constant, unnerving pressure designed to wear down their morale, to make them feel besieged and helpless. Rhea and young Maggie took it upon themselves to become the eyes and ears of the ranch. They spent their days riding the perimeter, their rifles always ready, their gazes sweeping the horizon for any sign of trouble. One afternoon, they spotted a lone rider watching the ranch from a distant butte. He was too far away to be identified, but he was not one of theirs. When he finally rode off, they did not return to the ranch but followed at a discreet distance, using the folds and canyons of the land for cover. The trail led them miles away to a hidden box canyon, a natural dead end with steep, defensible walls. There, tucked out of sight, was a small, crude camp. 3 men were hunkered around a low fire, their horses tied nearby. The men wore the familiar green bandanas of the Lobo Verde. As Rhea and Maggie watched from the rim of the canyon, hidden behind a jumble of rocks, they saw one of the men retrieve a heavy wooden crate from a canvas tent. He pried it open with a knife. Maggie drew in a sharp, audible breath. Rhea put a hand on her arm, a silent command to be still. The crate was filled with pale, waxy sticks and coils of fuse, dynamite, enough to level a building, enough to destroy a well. Their purpose was suddenly, terrifyingly clear. This was not about harassment anymore. This was about annihilation. They waited until the men had settled down for the night before slipping away into the darkness, their hearts pounding with the terrible knowledge of what they had found. While Jackson and his hands dealt with the constant physical threats, Eleanor prepared for a different kind of battle. She knew that Silas's legal claim, however flimsy, had to be fought with evidence, not just outrage. The judge would listen to facts, to data, not to the desperate pleas of ranchers. She gathered the women again, not in a field kitchen this time, but around the long table in the main house. Silas Rourke wants to claim this water belongs to him. She told them, her voice clear and resolute. We are going to prove that it belongs to everyone. She unrolled a large sheet of butcher paper. We will make a map, she explained. Not a surveyor's map, but a people's map. Each of you knows a spring, a seep, a seasonal creek on your land. You know how far the water table has fallen in your own wells. You know how many head of cattle a certain pasture can support. We are going to write it all down. For the next week, the women became historians and cartographers. They recorded oral histories of water use going back decades. They created a detailed ledger documenting every family, every herd, and every source of water in the valley. They marked it all on Eleanor's map, drawing in the creeks that no longer flowed and the wells that had gone dry. What emerged was not a legal document, but a testament. It was a portrait of a community's complete and utter dependence on the Coal Ridge well, a stark, factual rebuttal to the fiction of Silas's claim. Eleanor's neat, clear script filled page after page, her simple, declarative sentences building a case more powerful than any lawyer's argument. One evening, Reverend Ames rode out to the ranch. He found Jackson by the corral, staring into the darkness, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. The strain of the past weeks was evident in the hard set of his jaw. The Lord tests the righteous, son, the Reverend said quietly, coming to stand beside him. The Lord is not cutting my fences, Jackson replied, his voice a low growl. Rhea and Maggie found their camp. They have dynamite. Reverend, they mean to destroy the well, my father's well. He turned to the older man, his face a mask of contained violence. There is a part of me, a very big part, that wants to take every man I have and ride to that canyon. There would be no trial, no judge, just a long rope and a tall tree. That is the law they understand. That is the law of the wolf. Reverend Ames corrected him gently. It is quick, and it is satisfying to our baser instincts. But it is not justice. Justice builds. Vengeance only destroys. It would destroy the very thing you are fighting to protect. A community, a society. You cannot build a town on a foundation of graves. Jackson, you must trust in the law, even when it is slow and imperfect. What if the law fails us? Jackson asked, his voice raw. Then we trust in the truth, the Reverend said, nodding toward the house where a light burned in the window of the main room. The room where Eleanor was still working on her map. We trust in the evidence of our lives. You cannot fight Silas by becoming him. You have to be better. You have to choose to be... Jackson said nothing, but the rigid set of his shoulders relaxed slightly. The war inside him was not over, but the Reverend's words had given him a foothold on higher ground. The explosion came 3 nights before the wedding. It was a deep, guttural roar that seemed to come from the bowels of the earth, a sound that was felt as much as heard. The ground shuddered, rattling the windows in the ranch house and jolting everyone from their sleep. For a moment, there was a stunned, absolute silence, the kind that follows a cataclysm. Then came the shouting. They ran from the house, lanterns swinging wildly, their beams cutting frantic, useless paths through the blackness. The air was thick with the acrid smell of sulfur and dust. When they reached the stone well, a collective gasp of horror went through the crowd. It was gone. Where the sturdy, moss-covered stone structure had stood for 50 years, there was now a gaping black hole. The well had been blown inward. Its walls collapsed. The deep, life-giving shaft choked with a tomb of shattered rock and earth. The water, the very heart of the ranch and the hope of the valley, was buried, inaccessible, destroyed. A woman began to sob, a thin, hysterical sound in the shocked silence. Panic, cold and sharp, began to spread through the assembled hands. This was more than the loss of a building. It was the death of their lifeline. They were cut off, adrift in a dying land with a merciless enemy at their gates. Jackson stood at the edge of the crater, his face illuminated by the flickering lantern light. It was a ruin, a grave marker for his father's legacy and their future. All the anger he had been holding in check, all the violence he had suppressed, surged within him. The desire for immediate, brutal revenge was a fire in his blood. He could feel the weight of his pistol on his hip, a heavy, simple answer to this complex act of evil. Then he felt a hand on his arm. It was Eleanor. She stood beside him, her face pale but her eyes clear and steady. She did not say a word. She did not have to. Her presence was a reminder of his choice, of their shared promise to build something, not just to fight. He looked from her face to the frightened faces of his people, then back to the ruin of the well. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the smell of destruction filling his lungs. He was still a man of the West, and the call to vengeance was strong. But he was also the man who had promised to protect these people, to build a community. He looked toward the distant lights of redemption, toward the unseen county seat, toward the slow, grinding wheels of the law. When he finally spoke, his voice was not a roar of rage, but a low, cold, and utterly determined vow that cut through the night. "We will find who did this," he said, his words carrying to every person present, "and we will bring them to justice." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the crowd before settling on the dark horizon in the direction of Silas Rourke's holdings. "Not with a rope, with the law. I swear it." The destruction of the well settled over the valley like a shroud. There was no water for the new well, no reserves for the town. Despair was a quiet, constant presence at every meager meal. But beneath the fear, a cold, hard anger was taking root. Jackson's vow for legal justice had given them a focus, a single point of light in the suffocating darkness. They had a week until the circuit judge arrived, 1 week to turn a suspicion into an ironclad fact. The plan was born not of rage, but of cold, calculated logic, pieced together at the long timber table by Jackson, Eleanor, and Rhea. They could not prove Silas ordered the explosion, but they could prove he was tied to the men who did it. "We need to draw them out," Jackson said, his voice low. "Not into a fight, but into a trap." Eleanor looked at the map she had made, her finger tracing the thin steel line of the railroad track that ran a mile north of Silas Rourke's warehouse. "The railroad is his artery," she said. "He uses it to bring in his supplies, to move his men. It is his strength. We can make it his weakness." The idea took shape. A rumor would be planted in the Redemption Saloon by a ranch hand posing as a disgruntled railroad worker. The rumor would be of a secret shipment, a payroll or a special delivery of mining equipment, set to be temporarily stored in Silas's own warehouse for security before the final leg of its journey. The bait would be irresistible, an easy prize stored in their own den. "But how do we prove they were the ones at the well?" Rhea asked, her practical mind cutting to the heart of the problem. "A gunfight proves nothing." Eleanor thought of the supplies they had inventoried, the practical tools of ranch life. "We mark them," she said. "In Boston, the dock workers use colored chalk to mark crates. We have something better. We have the blue dye for marking sheep. It is concentrated, indelible. It stains everything it touches." The plan was set. A heavy, empty crate would be loaded onto a railroad handcar and taken to the warehouse under the cover of darkness. Inside the crate, among worthless rocks to give it weight, they would place a small, fragile clay pot filled with the vibrant blue dye. When the thieves broke open the crate to get their prize, the pot would shatter, marking their hands and their clothes with the evidence of their crime. The night of the trap was unnervingly still, the sky moonless and overcast. A damp chill was in the air, hinting at the long overdue rain. Jackson, Rhea, and 3 of their most trusted men were hidden in the deep shadows across from the silent, hulking shape of Silas's warehouse. They were armed, but their purpose was not to fight. Their purpose was to witness. A quarter mile down the track, The real heart of the plan waited. Eleanor sat in the cab of a small but powerful switching engine, a locomotive borrowed from a sympathetic railroad foreman who despised Silas Rourke. With her was Maggie, her young face pale with a mixture of fear and excitement. Eleanor's hands rested on the cold steel levers. She had spent 2 days learning their functions: the brake, the throttle, the deafening steam whistle. Her task was simple and terrifying. She was the wall that would close the trap. Hours crawled by. The silence stretched, fraying their nerves. Then they heard it. The soft, rhythmic plod of horses approaching not from the town, but from the east, from the direction of the Badlands. 4 riders materialized from the darkness, their forms indistinct, their movements quiet and professional. They dismounted, tethered their horses, and approached the warehouse. One of them produced a key, and the large door slid open with a low groan. They emerged moments later, carrying the heavy crate Jackson and Rhea had left inside. They carried it not toward their horses, but toward a flat car sitting idle on a siding next to the main track. They heaved it aboard. It was clear they intended to use the railroad to make their escape. "This is it," Jackson whispered to Rhea. "Now." He stepped out of the shadows, his rifle held ready but not aimed. "Let us talk about my well," he called out, his voice echoing in the night. The men spun around, dropping the crate. The sound of shattering pottery was lost in the sudden chaos. They drew their pistols. Their faces, now visible in the lantern they carried, were hard and cruel. They were the men from the canyon. The lead rider, a man with a jagged scar across his cheek, laughed. "You are a fool. Cole," he sneered, "you and 3 men. Then, from the darkness behind Jackson, more figures emerged. Reverend Ames, Jebediah Stone, a dozen other ranchers and townspeople, their faces grim, their hands holding not guns but lanterns. They were the jury. The gang, realizing they were cornered, made a desperate move. 2 of them provided covering fire while the scar-faced leader and another man scrambled onto the flat car. They released the brake, and with a hard shove, sent the heavy car rolling down the slight grade of the track, gathering speed as it moved away into the darkness. Rhea and Jackson were already moving. They sprinted for the siding, and with a powerful leap, they hauled themselves onto the back of the moving flat car. The wind whipped at them, the clatter of the steel wheels on the track a deafening roar. Sparks flew as the car sped faster, its momentum carrying it toward the main line and escape. What followed was a brutal, swaying battle in the dark. Rhea moved with a dancer's grace, disabling her opponent with a swift, disabling blow. Jackson faced the leader. It was a raw, physical confrontation, a fight of fists and fury on the rumbling, unstable platform. Back at the warehouse, the remaining 2 outlaws were quickly surrounded and subdued by the ranchers. Eleanor, watching the flat car's lantern recede into the distance, knew it was time. She pulled a lever, and the engine hissed to life, a great sigh of steam and power. Maggie shoveled coal, her movements fast and sure. The locomotive began to move, its massive wheels turning slowly at first, then faster, chugging down the track in pursuit. On the flat car, Jackson wrestled with the gang leader, the man's strength born of desperation. The outlaw lunged for his pistol, and for a moment, Jackson saw an opening, a clear chance to end it, to exact his revenge. The face of the Reverend, the memory of his vow, flashed in his mind. He did not take the shot. Instead, he slammed his shoulder into the man, sending them both crashing to the rough wooden planks. Ahead, the siding was about to merge with the main line. The flat car was moments from freedom. Then, a sound split the night, a sound unlike any other. It was the shriek of a steam whistle, a long, piercing, unearthly blast that seemed to shake the very ground. It was a sound of absolute authority. The engine appeared, a monstrous black shape blocking the track ahead, its single headlamp a cyclops eye pinning them in its glare. Eleanor stood in the cab, one hand on the whistle cord, pulling it again and again. The sound a declaration of an ending. Their escape was cut off. The flat car, its momentum spent, slowed and rolled to a stop just yards from the locomotive. The confrontation was over. The outlaws were bound, their hands and the front of their shirts stained with a telltale, brilliant blue. As the deputy sheriff, summoned by the Reverend, was taking them into custody, a lone rider approached. It was Silas Rourke, his face a perfect mask of concerned surprise. "What is all this commotion?" "Deputy," he asked, his voice smooth. "Bandits on my property." "It appears so, Mr. Rourke," the deputy said. Jackson walked toward him, his face hard in the lantern light. He held up the hands of the scar-faced gang leader. The blue stain was vivid, undeniable. "Strange," Jackson said. "The same color seems to be on the handle of your warehouse door." Silas paled slightly. "That is ridiculous. I know nothing about this." Eleanor stepped down from the engine cab. She carried her ledger and the map, and your prospecting permit. "Mr. Rourke," she said, her voice steady and clear. "The one you filed with the territorial court. The deputy has a copy. It seems the original survey dates on it were altered. The ink is a different shade. We have 20 witnesses who can testify that this valley has been settled and its water used by this community for 50 years. Your claim is a fraud." The trap had not just been for the outlaws. It had been for him. The townspeople, the jury, stared at Silas, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning fury. His web of lies, his legal manipulations, it all unraveled in the stark lamplight. Silas looked at Jackson, his mask of civility finally cracking, revealing the raw hatred beneath. His hand drifted toward the pistol at his side. Jackson stood his ground. He did not draw his own weapon. He just watched him, giving him the choice. The choice between a foolish, fatal act of violence and the slow, grinding justice of the law. Silas's gaze darted around at the ring of hostile faces. He was alone. His power, built on fear and deception, had vanished. He slowly raised his hands in surrender. Jackson turned his back on him then, leaving the deputy to his work. He looked at Eleanor, at Rhea, at the faces of his neighbors, and a great weight seemed to lift from his shoulders. He had chosen the harder path, and it had led them here, to a true victory. As if on cue, a low rumble of thunder echoed in the distance. A single drop of rain fell, then another, splattering in the dust. The long drought was breaking. The wind picked up, carrying the clean, fresh scent of a coming downpour. They were halfway back to the ranch when a rider came galloping to meet them, his face wild with joy. "Water!" he yelled, his voice cracking. "The new well? It is hit! Water!" They urged their horses on, the rain now falling in a steady, cleansing sheet. When they reached the digging site, it was to a scene of jubilation. A thick, muddy torrent of water was gushing from the shaft they had dug, pouring out onto the thirsty land. It was not a trickle. It was a flood, a powerful, life-giving pulse from the heart of the earth, unleashed at the very moment their ordeal had ended. Jackson dismounted and walked to the edge of the gusher, the cool, muddy water splashing against his boots. He looked up at the sky, the rain washing the dust and grime from his face. It was like a baptism, a washing clean of the vengeance that had so nearly consumed him, a promise of a new beginning for them all, forged in hardship and born, at last, into the light. The trial of Silas Rourke at the county seat was a quiet affair, devoid of the high drama of a gunfight but possessing the immense, unyielding weight of the law. The courtroom was packed, the benches filled with the ranchers and townspeople of redemption, their faces weathered and serious. Eleanor's map and ledger were presented as evidence, their neat columns and careful lines telling a story more damning than any single witness could. When laid beside Silas's fraudulent permit with its altered dates, the truth became as plain and solid as the courthouse walls. Silas, stripped of his power and his allies, was a diminished figure. his smooth words turning to dust in the face of Eleanor's meticulous facts. He was found guilty of conspiracy, fraud, and the destruction of property. The Lobo Verde gang, their blue-stained hands a mark of their guilt, were sentenced alongside him. His land claim was declared null and void. A ghost of a document returned to the grave. But the most significant verdict was not delivered by the judge. It was delivered by the community itself. In the wake of the trial, they formed a water council, a board made up of ranchers and town leaders. With Jackson Cole elected as its first chairman, the new well, and the old one they would eventually clear and restore, would belong to everyone, its use governed by shared need, not by a single man's greed. Justice had come, not from the end of a rope, but from the will of a united people. They were married a week later, not inside the church, but outside, on a patch of ground beside the new gushing well. The day was clear and bright, the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue. The air, washed clean by the recent rains, smelled of damp earth and new life. It was a simple ceremony. There were no fancy clothes or grand decorations. Eleanor wore a plain blue dress, the color of the Wyoming sky, and Jackson wore his best Sunday shirt. The entire valley seemed to be in attendance, their faces turned toward the couple, their presence a silent, powerful blessing. Martha Gable stood near the back, her severe expression softened by something that looked almost like admiration. She had brought a small, hand-stitched quilt as a wedding gift. Jebediah Stone, the farmer who had once shouted Eleanor down, stood beside Jackson as a witness, his broad shoulders a bulwark of support. The community, once fractured by suspicion and fear, was whole again. Reverend Ames performed the service, his voice warm and steady against the happy murmur of the well. He spoke of new beginnings, of love that is not found but forged, and of family that is built on a foundation of choice and commitment. When Jackson took Eleanor's hand, he did not place a gold ring on her finger. He retied the leather thong with a six-pointed star, the symbol of his promise, its meaning now known and honored by all. As they turned to face their friends and neighbors, a cheer went up, a joyful, heartfelt sound that rolled across the valley, promising a future as bright and hopeful as the water that flowed beside them. 2 years passed. The scars on the land and in their hearts began to fade, replaced by the deep, satisfying patterns of a life being built. The town of Redemption grew, not just in size, but in spirit. In the evenings, a warm light glowed from the windows of the old church house. Inside, Eleanor held a small school for the children and any adults who wished to learn. She taught reading and arithmetic, but she also taught history and geography, opening up a world beyond the confines of their valley. Her students were ranchers' sons, merchants' daughters, and young ranch hands like Maggie, who, after a long day in the saddle, would painstakingly trace the letters of her own name. Jackson, true to his role as chairman of the Water Council, had overseen the laying of a series of small aqueducts, simple timber troughs that carried a share of the new well's bounty to the smaller homesteads. The valley began to bloom with kitchen gardens and small, hardy orchards. He had become more than a rancher. He was a builder, a leader who measured his wealth not in cattle, but in the well-being of his neighbors. Maggie O'Rourke, her youthful recklessness tempered by experience, was now the head wrangler at Coal Ridge, a position of trust and skill few women held. She rode with a quiet confidence that reminded Eleanor of Rhea, and Rhea, her own dream realized, had started a small horse training operation on a parcel of land Jackson had deeded to her. She specialized in gentling the wild mustangs that still roamed the high plains. Her unique methods a blend of patience and profound understanding. Her reputation was already spreading across the territory. Even the Reverend Ames had seen a dream fulfilled. With a donation of books from Eleanor's family in Boston and funds raised by the Ladies' Purity Society, now repurposed as the Community Improvement Committee, a small lending library was established in a room off his church. It was a humble collection, but to the people of Redemption, it was a treasure beyond price. One cool autumn evening, Eleanor and Jackson sat on the porch of the ranch house. The wood was weathered to a soft gray, and a hardy vine with small, tenacious green leaves had begun to climb one of the posts. A comfortable silence stretched between them, the kind that exists only between two people who know each other's souls. The wind whispered through the tall cottonwood trees, and from the corral came the soft nickering of horses settling in for the night. Eleanor leaned her head against his shoulder, the rough wool of his shirt familiar and comforting. The leather thong on her wrist was dark with age, its edges worn smooth against her skin. "It was a long road," she murmured, her voice soft. He put his arm around her, pulling her close. His hand, calloused and strong, covered hers. "It was a good road," he replied. "It brought me you." She thought of the lie that had brought her here, of the fear and the guilt, but she also thought of the dust storm, of the fire, of the shared fight for survival, and the quiet, powerful love that had grown in the harshest of soil. Happiness, she had learned, was not a gift that fell from the sky. It was a choice you made every single day, a well you had to dig with your own two hands, a promise you had to keep to yourself and to the one you loved. Family was not a name on a piece of paper. It was the commitment to stand together, to build a life, to be a home for each other, no matter what storms might come. She turned her face up to his, and, in the fading light, she saw in his eyes the same steady, honest man who had met her on a dusty train platform so long ago. He had seen the truth of her all along, and he had chosen her, not in spite of her flaws, but because of the strength they had revealed. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And remember to subscribe to our channel Wild West Night. Like this video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.